world.
The UN has been very clear that it takes all these allegations very seriously. We support them in that. They have to be thoroughly investigated, and justice and accountability must be done.
A UN delegation in Haiti responds to allegations of ineffective and inappropriate assistance. And Brazil's plan to lift 60 million people out of extreme poverty within 2 years.
By 2014, extreme poverty will be part of the Brazilian past, never more of the Brazilian future.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
Thanks again for joining us. Also in the program, we'll learn about one of the most dangerous places on earth to work as a journalist. But first, up to 14 million people risk starvation in the Sahel region, according to the International Federation of the Red Cross. 9 countries face drought and food shortages in the semi-arid region, which stretches from east to West Africa along the border of the Sahara Desert. The agency is warning that if sufficient action is not taken, up to 23 million people could be affected. Charles Appel reports.
The Sahel, which is no stranger to cycles of severe droughts, continues to be plagued by poverty and very high rates of malnutrition. Mamadou Lamine Faye of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, who has recently visited Mauritania, says children and communities in rural areas are particularly vulnerable to malnutrition.
The reasons behind this increasingly serious situation are complex. Poor harvests, caused by a combination of failed rains and pest attacks on crops, rapid population growth, a rise in basic food prices, regional conflict, and recent large-scale population movement from Mali have all been contributory factors to this humanitarian crisis.
The countries that are at great risk of this food crisis are Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and Senegal. Mr. Faye again.
In Niger, almost 5.5 million people, or 35% of the population, are in a situation of what we term food insecure. Another 3.5 million could also follow suit before the next harvest. In Mauritania, an estimated 1.2 million people are potentially at risk following very poor harvests. Child malnutrition rates have reached emergency levels of between 15 and 18% in areas in both Mauritania and Chad.
Assistance is urgently needed to respond to the crisis in the Sahel, says Corinne Momal-Vagnon of the United Nations office in Geneva.
Across the region, international agencies have called for more than $720 million to support national efforts to respond to the crisis. And to date, donors have provided $135 million, and relief activities have already begun. But we need many more resources now, and to prevent a large-scale crisis, we need to act now, so the resources must come in now.
The IFRC says it's concerned that the emerging humanitarian crisis in the Sahel is underfunded because, as was the case in the Horn of Africa, early warnings of a humanitarian catastrophe go unheeded.
So it's the recurrent drought, high food prices, poor harvests and regional conflicts that are creating the serious food crisis in the African Sahel region. In fact, the situation is so serious that the World Food Programme and its partners are meeting in Rome to find ways of preventing the crisis from getting worse. Daniel Dickinson has also been discussing the situation in the Sahel region with World Food Programme spokesperson Gal Savignier.
Well, in the Sahel region, the situation is not very good. The drought has returned to the Sahel region, which is in west of Africa, bringing hunger to millions of people. The problem is that this drought is coming for the third time in 10 years. So this is really hard for the population to cope from one drought after the other. And actually, most families have still not recovered from the drought in 2010. And now they have to wait until the next harvest season in 2012, and it's really hard for them. So what they do is that the families are selling everything that they have left, all their remainings. They're taking the children out of school. They're migrating to urban areas. Sometimes they're even migrating to neighboring countries. This is why the World Food Programme is now saying that the humanitarian needs are huge.
How serious is this, though? How serious could it become?
The humanitarian needs are quite huge, and now is really the time for action. The World Food Programme and its partners are launching a regional response to reach more than 8 million people with food assistance.
The various agencies are appealing for $720 million. You've received $63 million. It doesn't look very good at the moment.
No, it's not much. The needs are really big. And right now, the World Food Programme is actually purchasing food stocks and deploying specialized teams to the region in advance. We do that ahead of time, in advance of the peak hunger season, because we want to ensure that food will be available to the most vulnerable people. Who are the most vulnerable? It's especially women and children.
But if you don't get the money, you won't be able to provide any food. Is that correct?
We're doing our best. We actually started to purchase some food stocks. This is what is called a forward purchase facility, in order to procure more than 62,000 metric tons of assorted commodities. It's enough to feed more than 4 million people for a month. And this will dramatically reduce the normal lead time it takes to move food into the remote areas. And the remote areas is generally where the food is needed the most.
Why hasn't the international community reacted quicker to this crisis? I mean, we've known about the problem in the Sahel for some time.
Well, actually, no. We are reacting fast because we are really preparing and stocking food in advance.
I understand today WFP is getting together with other agencies. What do you hope will be achieved?
Well, the World Food Programme is hosting this meeting with the heads of humanitarian agencies and donor governments in order to address the urgent need for scaling up of the humanitarian assistance in the Sahel. We are expecting to deliver a joint statement. This is a great opportunity for all the heads of agencies and the donor governments to be together and discuss how serious the situation is in the Sahel region, and to do this ahead of time, before the crisis really happens.
Somalia remains one of the most dangerous places in the world to work as a reporter. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, at least 37 journalists have been killed in the line of duty in Somalia since 1992. The latest victim was Hussein Osman Abdi, the director of Radio Shabelle, who was gunned down outside his home in Mogadishu on the 28th of January. Mohammed Keita, the African Advocacy Coordinator for the CPJ, told Diane Penn that journalists in Somalia face pressures and censorship from both the traditional government and al-Shabaab insurgents.
The censorship has manifested itself through closures of radio stations, arrest of journalists, and murder. It turns out that Hassan had been investigating corruption in Mogadishu seaport, and he was killed in an area of the city that was under the control of the transitional government. There's been 4 suspects arrested. We welcome the interest of the international community calling for an independent investigation. It is important because at least 37 journalists have been killed in the line of duty in Somalia since 1992. And in none of these cases have we registered a conviction or any form of partial justice for the killers. This ongoing impunity creates a climate of fear and chills the press into self-censorship. And it has driven dozens and dozens of Somali journalists into exile.
And tell us, the issues of censorship and repression of journalists, does that also apply to international correspondence? How do we get our news about Somalia?
We get our news from Somalia mainly through the work of local journalists. We had, for instance, a few months ago, the New York Times reported a big story about the alleged use of child soldiers by the transitional government. And this story was, in fact, broken by their local correspondent in Mogadishu, Mohammed Ibrahim. And Mohammed Ibrahim was able to obtain exclusive photos showing children in uniform in Mogadishu and being given weapons. As soon as this story was published on the New York Times, Mohammed Ibrahim had to flee Mogadishu because the transitional federal government attempted to arrest him. Meanwhile, the New York Times reporter who flew in to do the story, Jeffrey Geltman, had already left the country.
You mentioned that journalists have to leave Somalia for exile. Do we have any journalists actually able to return to Somalia? I mean, the situation there is, from what I understand, I've never been, basically like a hell on earth.
The overwhelming number of journalists who leave Somalia never return. The press corps has been depleting.
What is CPJ hoping will happen? You said previously investigations into deaths of other journalists have yielded no convictions.
At times there were arrests, but the suspects were released and no one ever talked about it. There was no accountability. The reason why we insist on this case is because there have been 4 suspects arrested in police custody, and this murder happened in a government-controlled area of Mogadishu. So it's a crime that's totally solvable.
The head of the UN's political office, which was based in Nairobi for many years, moved to Somalia, I think about a week or so ago. What role do you see the UN or other international agencies play in all of this?
The UN always calls for the protections of civilians, and in that civilian populations, journalists should be a priority because of their profession. Their public profile exposes them to tremendous risks. And especially if the journalists are reporting on issues of human rights abuses or corruption. We had the situation in the Ivory Coast last year where there was a UN peacekeeping force, and we were able to get them on board to help evacuate some journalists who had come under threat using their assets since they had troops on the ground.
Last question. Is there anything further you would like our listeners to know about CPJ's work advocating for Somali journalists together with journalists worldwide?
In protecting and assisting Somali journalists, we don't do it alone. We work with a whole range of local and international groups. So we are seeking more and more partners interested in this issue. At the end of the day, we are trying to keep the flow of information coming to all of us so we all know what's going on in Somalia. These are our witnesses on the ground.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
Plant a tree and save a bee. That's the motto of the Apiculture and Nature Conservation Organisation of Cameroon. Director Paul Mazeka has been recognised as one of the world's forest heroes for his work which links beekeeping with the conservation of forests in his country. After teaching for 30 years, Mr. Mazeka retired and founded the Northwest Bee Farmers Association in 1990. Mr. Mazeka and his dedicated team have planted 685,000 trees, and their target is 1 million before 2013. Mr. Mazeka was in New York to receive the Forest Heroes Award and explained to Derek Mabartha how his work of preserving forests started.
I started by trying to make people understand through apiculture, that is training people to keep bees for harvesting honey. And then I introduced the idea of producing small quantities of honey. When your hive should produce a large quantity, what is the problem? Then they realized that it was because of the shortage of nectar and pollen. And therefore, we should plant more trees to get more honey. And so we took the decision that for each hive, the owner should plant 10 trees. And that went on for some time.
When was that?
It was between 1992 and 2000. We carried out that activity. At the end of it, the organization that were supporting us did an evaluation and found that we had planted a total of 350,000 trees.
Tell me, how many people are involved or were involved in this project?
Oh, it is not everybody that was trained in bee farming who planted trees, but those who were actually trained according to our records was between 6,000 and 7,000, I think.
My question, of course, was how beekeeping is linked to the preservation of forests.
Apart from planting trees, a trained bee farmer becomes an environmentalist simply because the bees survive on trees, and therefore the owner has to protect the beehive against fire. So he has to go out and clear around in the dry season to prevent fire. And so they become enemies of bushfire. They are easily convinced that for their activity to survive, they must keep away bushfires. And so they become sort of supporters of those who are trying to save forests, those who are trying to save water points, and so on. Through beekeeping, they can easily understand that to survive and get an income, you have to prevent bushfires.
I'm curious about how you got interested in the whole business of beekeeping, because I understand you're a teacher.
Yes. I got interested through the interest of conservation. We realized that to go to the village people and ask them to protect a forest, they don't know why they should protect a forest, unless you make them understand the need. So this beekeeping was a means of introducing the communities to conservation. And so they ended up planting so many trees. They ended up protecting the bushes that were still existing because they will keep their beehives in those bushes. So I did not get direct interest in beekeeping. We used beekeeping as an entry point to conservation.
Now, is apiculture, as it is called,
yes,
thriving in Cameroon now?
Oh, yes. I think Cameroon is becoming very important. Apiculture had existed as part of the culture of some of the areas in Cameroon, but it was done in a crude way. It was even the source of bushfires.
In a crude way, what do you mean?
For example, they used naked fire to go harvesting, and accidentally, those fires caused bushfires. Again, they harvested honey and tried to process it using their hand by squeezing the combs and all that. So we saw the need to introduce the harvesting of honey using a smoker, that is a device that produces smoke, but not naked. There's fire inside, but it is so protected that it cannot start a bushfire. And then we saw the need to teach them how to drain honey in a hygienic way, handle it properly, and then bottle it and package it for sale. And at the end, we test and see whether it is good honey or not.
Talking about packaging it for sale, does Cameroon now export honey?
Yes, they do export honey. We have a unique type of honey. It has its own niche in the market. They call it the Oku white honey. It has a ready market both within the country and outside. We're exporting that.
Now, tell me, Mr. Mzeka, are you planning to plant more trees?
Oh, yes, we are going to plant more trees. I want to retire when I have passed 1 million trees. Yes, because my organization has reached 685,000. So it is just a matter of 300 and something thousand. We can do that in 2 or 3 years. We will complete 1 million.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
In Haiti, an international security and support contingent has been stationed there since the devastating earthquake decimated the island nation 2 years ago. A delegation from the United Nations recently toured the country to make an appraisal of the contingent's effectiveness. NTN 24's Brian Andrews reports.
The United Nations Security Council has sent a delegation to Haiti this week to assess security before it makes a decision on whether to reduce the number of peacekeepers it has there, cutting foreign infantry battalions while keeping military engineering units to help with infrastructure projects and maintaining a strong international police presence. The UN peacekeeping force in Haiti is known as MINUSTA.
Yes, we are also here to assess MINUSTA. Clearly, the Security Council has a stake in MINUSTA's success and effectiveness. In our last resolution passed in October, Resolution 2012, we underscored the importance of the mission adhering to its responsibilities and dealing with any allegations of abuse or mistreatment that have arisen both prior to that resolution and subsequently.
There's been mounting public unease over the UN role in Haiti after recent allegations of rape involving Pakistani and Uruguayan peacekeepers, plus anger over the 2010 cholera outbreak linked to the peacekeeping force.
The UN has been very clear that it takes all these allegations very seriously. We support them in that. They have to be thoroughly investigated, and justice and accountability must be done. And we will be very plain and clear-eyed as we assess what the challenges are and where improvements are needed.
However, the U.S. ambassador was quick to defend the UN's mission in Haiti.
MINUSTA has played a critical role in improving stability and governance in Haiti and in creating the conditions for security, reconstruction, and development, both before and after the earthquake, in which it too lost over 100 of its own.
The council members will be visiting 3 cities as well as visiting the Haitian parliament and earthquake resettlement camps, along with a police training facility while they're in country.
NTN 24's Brian Andrews with that report. Authorities in Brazil have come up with a plan to lift 60 million Brazilians out of extreme poverty in 2 years' time. Under the plan, known as Brazil Without Extreme Poverty, the Latin American country hopes to beat the deadline set by world leaders in 2000 to eradicate extreme poverty by 2015. Luis Henrique Paiva, Secretary for National Income and Citizenship, discussed the plan with Monica Grayley.
The Plan Brazil Without Extreme Poverty is an initiative that tends to mobilize Brazil to try to overcome extreme poverty. President Dilma is leading this initiative together with governors of states, mayors, CEOs, and federal public firms, and NGOs, and a series of other organizations that are addressed to eradicate extreme poverty in Brazil. It's a national mobilization, and we are assured that by 2014, extreme poverty will be part of the Brazilian past, never more of the Brazilian future.
What is the Plan Brazil Without Extreme Poverty, and how many people are reached? How much is invested? Can you explain the main topics of this plan?
The plan was launched by President Dilma Rousseff in June 2011. And it's a threefold initiative. It involves an income assurance, access to public services, and productive inclusion of beneficiaries. Income assurance is guaranteed basically by the Bolsa Família program, which is probably the largest conditional cash transfer program in the world. Access to public services are being guaranteed by a series of initiatives in the area of healthcare, education, housing, and so on and so forth. Finally, and productive inclusion is related to a series of programs addressed to job training and for people who are living in urban areas, and distribution of seeds and water for people living in rural areas, and some support, financial support for them to support the production of food. So overall, these three sorts of different initiatives intend to lift out of extreme poverty 60 million Brazilians who are still living in extreme poverty until 2014.
It is expected to be invested only in 2012, $10 billion in the Bolsa Família. Given the international crisis, would it be there any risk to finance a program like this in Brazil?
Oh, not in Brazil, really. Actually, the overall cost of the program is like 0.4% of GDP. So it continues to be a relatively cheap and affordable program. What can explain why it reaches 13 million families at the same time it costs relatively affordable price is that it's a very well targeted program. So we are making small transfers, but to the right families, that is the neediest families in the country. So overall, the cost is relatively low. The administrative costs are low as well, and the program can be maintained and inclusive in a situation, global recession.
And finally, how can this experience be applied to other parts of the world?
Actually, CCT programs, or conditional cash transfer programs, have been implemented in more than 17 countries nowadays, most of them in Latin America. It's a very flexible kind of program that can be adopted by several different contexts, national contexts. They tend to be very effective in the fight against poverty, and at the same time relatively cheap, and compromising is only a small part of the federal budget.
Still in South America, and heavily subsidized public transport in Argentina is about to come to an end. The price of a bus ticket could increase by up to 3 times the subsidized cost unless travellers are in significant need and hold a special ticket entitling them to a discounted fare. Al Jazeera's Teresa Bow is in Buenos Aires.
Waiting in line to access cheap transport fares. From now on, only those holding this card will be able to continue benefiting from the government subsidies.
I finally made it. I need this card because I'm retired. I cannot afford a regular fare, so I had to come in here and wait in line.
But the wait can be a long one, and under the hot summer sun. People here know that those who do not get the card will have to start paying 80 cents for a bus or subway ride. With a card, that same trip will cost half the price. These lines are at least a kilometer long, as people here have to wait for hours to be able to get the card. For years, the Argentine population benefited from cheap utility services and transport fares. Now the government wants to subsidize only those who can prove that they are in need. Since the government began cutting back on subsidies, people in some areas have seen their bills rise almost 300%. Morena Abad travels by bus every day. She says she is worried because inflation and the subsidy cuts will make it more difficult to make ends meet.
My card is still pending. I'm not sure what criteria they are applying, so people get it or not. Nobody knows how much the tickets are going to cost for sure. Prices are going up in Argentina, and now we have to get this new card.
Argentina implemented the subsidy programs almost 10 years ago as a way to spur an economic recovery after the crisis in 2001. Economists say that the subsidies should have been removed a long time ago.
The subsidies have been mismanaged. It was okay to maintain them after the crisis of 2001, but when Argentina started to recover, they should have started to allow prices to increase slowly. Now they're doing it all of a sudden, so it's going to be more difficult for people to adapt.
And that's one of the reasons why people here continue to line up. As the Argentine government is trying to save some money, many fear about the consequences it will have on their daily lives. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
And that is The World for this week. If you want to learn more about the program or wish to make a contribution to the show, then please do visit us at www.theworldradioshow.com. From there you can also access our Facebook page and join the discussion on any of the topics raised in this program. The World is committed to bringing you the stories that affect the people of our planet, either on a mass or individual scale, and we hope to do so with balance and integrity. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions, so please do keep in touch via www.theworldradioshow.com. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I look forward to your company next time. Until then, bye for now.